Hi, today we're going to talk about what we've been up to in the last year or so. This is the 2022 vegetable update. I'm Rachel Rudolph, the Extension Vegetable Specialist for the University of Kentucky. So we're going to discuss a broccoli planting date project that Dr. Rick Besson and I worked on in 2020 and 2021. It was repeated in 2021. And basically that project evaluated the use of planting date for spring broccoli pest management. And I'll show you the results of that. It's pretty interesting. The head lettuce cultivar trial, spring planted high tunnel lettuce in 2021, and the kale cultivar trial, which was spring planted in a high tunnel in 2021. So the spring planted field broccoli, the beds were shaped and plastic was laid in the fall preceding the spring production. So it does, and that happened in November of 2019 and then again in 2020. And you can see here in the field, this is the spring now, but it does require a bit of forethought and planning to get stuff ready in the fall because it's just so wet or unpredictable here to count on being able to get in the field and get the beds prepared in the spring. So our strategy was to do it in the fall. So for those of you wondering, the plastic did last. It was a little beat up, but it was still totally usable by, the spring, about 5 months later. The beds were on 7-foot centers and the top of the bed was about 3 feet wide. Marathon broccoli is a very cold hardy broccoli cultivar. We used transplants that were seeded into 72 cell trays. And you can see we had 2 rows, about 15-inch in-row spacing, and they were staggered. 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen was divided over 10 weeks. We used calcium nitrate. So here you can see, so early in the spring, you may see this purpling in a lot, not just broccoli, but in other spring plants. And that is usually, if you've done a soil test and you can confirm that there is phosphorus and plenty of phosphorus, and there was in our case, usually this is due primarily to just cold temperatures. The roots aren't able to take up those nutrients. And as you can see, they grow out of it. So as soon as the soil warms up a little bit more, things are fine. So you can see here, you can see this staggered planting dates. Some plants are much bigger than others, and there were 3 planting dates. So early planting, which was mid-March, mid-planting, which is what we would typically recommend for Central Kentucky growers, which is late March, and then a late planting, which is mid-April. So the plants were planted about 3 weeks apart each. And there was another component to this project. So no pesticides and with pesticides. So anything with a plus received pesticide treatments as needed. So that required weekly scouting, where we randomly selected 3 plants and looked for any pests. That required turning over leaves and really getting down in the plants in many cases. If pests were found, they had to meet the threshold to spray. And that was determined by Dr. Besson's lab and his program. And in many cases, the threshold was fairly low depending on the pest. So transplant dates, in 2020, it was March 11th. Seeded in the greenhouse on 219 in 72 cell trays. The mid planting date was 3/30. That means it was seeded on 224, and late 4/20 and seeded on 3/16. So dates were very similar, as you can see. We tried to keep it very, very similar in 2021. So yield was actually a really important component of this project, right? Okay, you say, well, we managed pests, but the yield was bad. Well, in this case, we found that yield was actually quite a bit better in the early and mid planting dates compared to the late. So early was harvested on 5/18 and 5/20, about 9 weeks after transplanting. So that is a delayed maturity, which is not uncommon. Usually you would add at least 25% to your days to maturity when you're planting out of that optimal recommended date. So, and that's when temperatures aren't as optimal for that cultivar or that species. Mid was harvested on 5/27, about 8 weeks after transplanting, and late was harvested on 6/11, about 7 weeks after transplanting. So you can say, oh, well, it had a faster transplanting in the late treatment, but you can also see that there was zero marketability in 2020. So things were, the heads didn't form at all, and just immediately bolted, or there was so much damage that it was not marketable. So early was significantly higher yield than mid, regardless of pesticide application, which we found to be pretty interesting. So anything with a different letter means that it is significantly different. So A is significantly different than B and C, right? Same goes for marketable count. So depending on your market, you may find that it's not so much the weight of your broccoli crowns, but maybe the number of broccoli crowns. And again, marketable count was significantly higher for early, regardless of pesticide application. Non-marketability was likewise pretty much the opposite, low for early and mid, and quite a bit higher for late. And the reason this number is so small here is because there were no heads to count, right? So this is a no pesticide application in late April. And so as you can imagine, the caterpillars were out and damage was done, and there was also quite a bit of bolting. 2021 was similar, but in this case, early and mid were about the same. They were not significantly different from one another. So early and early plus, mid and mid plus were all about the same, statistically speaking. The counts, however, were a little bit more broken out. Early had the highest marketable count, but was not significantly different from early plus. It was, however, significantly different from mid and mid plus. So basically, they were more heads compared to mid and mid plus, and perhaps maybe smaller heads. So again, late had no marketable weight or count in 2021. And so here you can see harvested 519, 67, and 622 respectively for early, mid, and late treatments. Here's another way to look at it. If you prefer the bar graph over the table, just very drastic numbers, as you can see. And again, here's the non-marketable comparison. So non-marketable yield and non-marketable head count. So this would be, right, what we would consider pretty much a perfect broccoli crown, broccoli head. This would be our ideal marketable broccoli. This one, of course, is edible, but in most cases would be considered probably unmarketable unless you're maybe a CSA or direct to consumer, where a little bit of things don't have to be perfect. Certainly for a wholesale grower, that would not be acceptable. Here is some cold damage, some chewing from caterpillar damage right here, this big hole here. And here is hollow stem. We didn't see a lot of this. We were pretty careful with our nitrogen applications. We saw maybe 2 or 3 of these throughout the field. But it can be a serious issue for marketability. Total observed pests. So the early plus in 2020 had pretty low numbers. Mid and mid plus were different from one another, and late plus were also different from one another. So you can see from a pest standpoint, right, there are differences. In 2021, we just had fewer pests overall, especially compared to the late. There were a lot of flea beetles in 2020, and we did not see that number as much in 2021. So observed caterpillars 2020 and 2021. So again, orange is 2021. You can see we saw a lot more caterpillars in 2021 and a lot more flea beetles in 2020. So flea beetles do chew on the leaves. They do cause damage, but they're not as much of a concern because it did not appear that they were doing any damage to the head of the broccoli, where the piece of the plant that you would be selling and trying to make a profit off of. So they weren't as much a cause for concern. Certainly caterpillars can be devastating. And here is a snapshot of what we saw, roughly: flea beetles, imported cabbage worm, flea beetles, diamondback moth. By late plus, we saw the full host of things. The number of pesticide applications were pretty much the same in 2020 and 2021. The products applied, Mustang Max was primarily for the flea beetles. Javelin is a BT product, and that is primarily for the caterpillars, intended for the caterpillars. So again, mostly caterpillars in 2021. And here's some snapshots. There's some frass here, quite a few caterpillars doing some serious damage. So planting early allows for less pesticide applications. We see that, right? So we had 1 pesticide application in early planting and 3 in late planting. And that's us being conservative and really scouting carefully. Mid-March plants matured about twice as slow compared to optimal planting date of late March, early April. So that early planting date was slower. Late planted broccoli also matured slowly because of the heat. So there is a reason, right, that we have that recommended planting date of late March, early April. And it may be difficult to plant early if beds have not already been prepped in the fall. So this isn't perhaps a foolproof method, but it can help growers who either don't have the time to apply pesticides or don't want to apply pesticides. And certainly every hour you spend in the field costs money. And so being able to strategically plan to focus your energy elsewhere and not having to apply a pesticide is not only great from an environmental standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. So, but again, it does require prior planning. Spring rains can really make field prep challenging or basically impossible in some cases. Working in the soil while wet leads to compaction, so you don't want to drive a tractor in a wet field. Even if you physically can get in there and get the tractor in and out, it's bad for the soil structure. So on to spring planted high tunnel lettuce, seeded in the greenhouse on January 21, 2021, transplanted to the high tunnel on March 2nd, harvested on April 6th. There were 11 cultivars. All of this was head lettuce. So this is not cut and come again. This is all head lettuce. You can see 4 rows per bed, about 3 feet wide. In row spacing is 12 inches. Between row spacing is 9 inches. It was fertigated twice, 12.5 pounds per acre of calcium nitrate. And we used, you can see this row cover here in the background, 1.5 ounce per square yard of row cover as needed. And you can see, you can kind of see the hoops here ready for that row cover. So our row cover was 1 big sheet. This makes it go a little bit faster, but usually does require another person to help you It doesn't, you don't have to have one other person, but it does make it go a lot faster. And you can see these hoops are here to protect and make sure the row cover doesn't bump the plants. And then we just hold it down with rock bags. The sides of the high tunnel were also then rolled down. So here are the cultivars we used: Butter Crunch, Dragoon, Harmony, Marciano, Milagro, Pomegranate, Sangria, Stanford, Roxy, Truchas, and Winter Density. They're somewhere between a Butterhead and a Romaine, all again head lettuce with various days to maturity. So, and here's a few shots of them up close. You can kind of see these looked really good. This is on the day of harvest. Milagro is very nice. Harmony does well. Butter Crunch is kind of your standard one that you see a lot of. Roxy, Pomegranate, Sangria, your red leaves. And then these two are smaller by design. That's not them, you know, anything wrong with them. They are minis or almost minis. And Marciano. So mean marketable yield. You can see that Harmony overall had the highest yield, but it was not significantly different than most of the others. Marciano, it was. Stanford, Truchas, those were smaller. So not surprisingly, it was different from there. And Winter Density, excuse me, had the highest yield overall, followed by Harmony. So mean head weight. So again, if you're interested in, this is everything weighed together. This is an average, or the mean head weight, right? We counted the number of heads and then divided that by, use that to divide by the mean marketable yield. So depending on your market, maybe you want a nice large head of lettuce, or maybe you're interested in count, right? And so here's count. And so we aim to harvest 8. In some cases that did not happen, as you can see, but for the most part, they did really well. There was no pesticide applications. We also did total soluble solids, which is a Brix, and that is an indication of flavor. And so many people may not think about Brix when it comes to greens, leafy greens, but it can help, you know, indicate good flavor. So here we have Winter Density again did really well. Harmony though was a little bit higher, but not significantly different. A lot of the Dragoon did well, Pomegranate, Roxy, all of those did very well in the total soluble solids evaluation. So the majority of the lettuce cultivars were harvested within their projected days to maturity, which is great. This is probably because of the air temperatures during the month of March were close to optimum for lettuce production. Harmony performed the best across all measured parameters, highest yielding of all the cultivars, significantly higher yield than Marciano, Truchas, and Stanford, and had the highest measurable Brix overall. So I would say really Harmony and Winter Density did the best overall together. And Sangria also performed well. Stanford had significantly lower yield than all other cultivars except for Truchas. Butter Crunch, which is a standard, really standard lettuce cultivar, had the lowest Brix measurement and was significantly lower than Harmony, Winter Density, Pomegranate, Dragoon, and Roxy. So here's some disease pressure. We didn't have much. This was on the day of harvest. This is a lettuce mosaic virus transmitted most likely from aphids. This was really all we saw. Now later, after we'd already collected the data, you can see this is lettuce drop. This is sclerotinia. You can see the sclerotia in here. And this, so that's in our high tunnel, but because we were harvesting early, we planted early, we harvested early, we were able to avoid this completely. So only some of the plants that were left behind suffered from this. So a grower who did who followed our dates wouldn't have left anything behind, and would not have even known this was an issue, most likely. You can see it here out in the field, very similar, just wilted, and then it becomes mushy. So when grown in early spring, single cut lettuce can be fairly low maintenance. Again, we had no pesticide applications. Growers who are interested in a lower maintenance cool season crop with market potential may want to consider a butterhead or a romaine type lettuce because it's quick, right? We transplanted it and then a month later harvested. They grow rapidly, which allows time for growers to prepare the high tunnel for another spring planted crop, such as tomatoes. So you pull that lettuce out and you're good to go for your tomato, and you're on time. With the same spacing utilized in this trial, which would be an in row of 12 inches and a between row of 9 inches, and 5 to 7 3-foot wide beds. Let's say you have a 30 by 96 high tunnel, a grower could potentially have between 1,700 to 2,400 plants in there. This estimation assumes that about 85 feet of the length of the high tunnel would be utilized. Usually we come in a little bit and don't run the entire length of the tunnel. Spring planted high tunnel kale was seeded in the greenhouse January 21, transplanted to the high tunnel on March 4th. It was harvested April 7th to August 13th. So this was over many weeks, many months. It was harvested about every 2 weeks. We had 6 cultivars, 3 rows per bed. You can see that here. In row spacing 12 inches, between row spacing 12 inches. It was fertigated 3 times, 12.5 pounds per acre of calcium nitrate, and row cover was used when needed early in the spring. So here we have Black Magic, Dark Boar, Dazzling Blue, Red Boar, Red Russian, and Bates. Various days to maturity, Lacinato and Curly, and then a Siberian Russian type. And here they are, Red Boar, Dark Boar, that classic Curly, Red Russians, that Russian Siberian type. And here's 2 Lacinatos and Bates. So yield, count, and again, total soluble solids, the mean marketable yield, overall, the Red Russian and the Bates had really large leaves. So especially as we got in further into, late spring, early summer, those leaves got really big and really affected the mean marketable yield, right? Early on, things were about the same size, but, and they're also very dense leaves. Compared to Red Boar and Dark Boar, for example. Total soluble solids were measured early on the first harvest and then 2 weeks later. So as far as flavor, Dazzling Blue had the highest total soluble solids, but it wasn't significantly different from Red Boar or Dark Boar or Black Magic. Again, Dazzling Blue had the highest total soluble solids, but Red Boar was the only one that was not significantly different. So the highest yielding kale cultivars measured the lowest for total soluble solids in both measurements on 2 different dates. Dazzling Blue had the highest total soluble solids. So throughout the season, the leaves of Red Russian and Bates were much larger than the other cultivars, and that may be the reason for the lower Brix values, as the sugars had to be distributed across more area of the plant. No taste tests were conducted. The total soluble solids measurements are, as I said before, are helpful in indicating flavor and may be useful for growers when selecting a cultivar for their crop. When grown in the early spring, kale can be low maintenance, but as the temperatures increase, pest management can become more time consuming. We did have to spray a few times, especially for harlequin bug. Kale is intended to be harvested multiple times and therefore really takes up a precious high tunnel space. So spring planted kale may not be the way to go, as you probably have other things you want to go in that tunnel. So either put it in the field or wait until the fall, where you're not rushing to get something else in there, most likely. Right, it's kind of the temperature's warmer, especially in, once we hit May and June, it gets too warm for kale in the high tunnel, and it's just taking up that precious space for something else. So both the lettuce and the kale variety trials can be found in this fruit and vegetable research report. That is, you can get it at your county extension office or online. There's a PDF of it online. If you're interested in other vegetable crops, you're a commercial grower and you want to know more production practices, certainly the Vegetable Production Guide for Commercial Growers, ID 36. That is a very handy guide. We update every 2 years. The Kentucky Vegetable Crops Extension and Research YouTube channel has a lot of videos that you can find on a variety of different topics. And you can also follow us on Instagram at UK Veg Crops. And that is, you'll see updates and announcements and what we're doing in the field in real time.